Hello, everyone, and welcome to a panel discussion hosted by Mitvim, the Israeli Institute for Regional Foreign Policies, on how enhanced multilateralism can help advance Israeli-Palestinian peace. My name is Merav Kahana-Dagan, and I am the deputy head of the Mitvim Institute. Mitvim is an Israeli think tank celebrating its 10th anniversary this year. Mitvim focuses on improving Israel's foreign policy, promoting Israel's regional belonging in the Middle East, Europe, and the Mediterranean, and advancing Israeli-Palestinian peace. Mitvim generates pro-peace foreign policy knowledge and recommendations and puts them into use by engaging with Israeli and international stakeholders. We regularly work with members of parliament, senior government officials, diplomats, journalists, scholars, and civil society leaders. Over the years, Mitvim has cooperated closely with J Street, and we appreciate its dedicated work to advance diplomacy and Israeli-Palestinian peace. We thank J Street for giving us this virtual platform to share with you our insights, as well as those of Mitvim's distinguished global partners. Although the US is central on the global stage, past experience have shown that it cannot resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict alone. However, finding the right models for multilateral pro-peace action did not prove to be an easy task. The coming power of the Biden administration, which restores American support of the two-state solution and which adheres to a multilateral foreign policy approach, may open new opportunities for Israeli-Palestinian peacemaking. At the Mitvim Institute, we are working to map these opportunities and to devise policy paths for their fulfillment. On this panel, we will explore how joint action by the US and the international community can effectively promote peace, including through a collective mechanism, agreed upon parameters, and a two-state solution, and a coordinated package of peace incentives. We also will relate to the Abraham Accords and how they can be leveraged to advance peace and to the upcoming Palestinian elections. I would like to thank and introduce our honorable speakers. We have here with us today former Ambassador Hesham Youssef, an Egyptian diplomat and a senior fellow at the USIP, the United States Institute for Peace. He served as an Assistant Secretary General of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, the OIC, and as in key positions at the Arab League, as spokesman, Chief of Staff to Secretary General, and Senior Advisor to the Secretary General. Mr. Nickolay Mladenov, a Bulgarian politician and diplomat who served since 2015 and until recently as the UN Special Coordinator for the Middle East peace process. During this time, he played a critical role in preventing escalation in Gaza. Mr. Mladenov previously served as Bulgaria's Minister of Defense and Minister of Foreign Affairs and is the UN Special Representative for Iraq. Dr. Nathalie Tocci, the Director of the Italian International Affairs Institute, IAI, and Honorary Professor at the University of Tübingen. She is Special Advisor to EU High Representative and Vice President of the Commission, Josep Borrell, and as Special Advisor to HR VP Federica Mogherini, she wrote the European Global Strategy and worked on its implementation. Finally, we have with us Dr. Nimrod Goren, the founder and head of Mitvim Institute, and a teaching fellow in Middle East Studies at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He is a former visiting fellow at J Street and is the recipient of the Victor J. Goldberg Prize for Peace in the Middle East and of the Centennial Medal of the Institute of International Education. In the first round, each panelist will speak for 7 minutes. Ambassador Youssef, the floor is all yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Merav, and I also welcome my fellow panelists. Let me indicate at the outset that I was asked to answer 3 questions. The first question is whether I see new opportunities. The second was, can an enhanced multilateral approach be helpful? And the third is, what can be done? Let me start with the first one, whether I see new opportunities. Unfortunately, to be frank about this, I don't see a real opportunity. But even if there isn't one, our job is to create opportunities. And I think that this is what we need to do. Merav, you mentioned at the outset that the US cannot resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict alone. You're right. But I think that the US can work with the parties involved to resolve it. But the political capital that is needed to achieve this objective is exuberantly high. And of course, the US is not ready or willing to make this commitment at this time. We know that the US administration does not consider this conflict a priority. And it also wants to continue to reduce its footprint in the Middle East. And perhaps its main concern is to ensure that the ensuing vacuum as a result of its withdrawal would not be filled by China, Russia, or ISIS. I also recognize what you mentioned, that the US is inclined to to adopt an approach that is more of a multilateral approach in its foreign policy. And this is a positive development. But my difficulty is that the US officially indicated that it believes that a final settlement cannot be reached at this point in time. Also, the United States is not formulating a policy that would put the conflict on a path to achieve peace. President Biden is yet to take advantage of the honeymoon that an incoming president usually enjoys, even by implementing some of the steps that he already announced during his campaign that he is going to be implementing. There was a recent press report on a leaked US official document regarding resetting the US-Palestinian relations. And it reflects an approach that is quite limited, very timid, and with very low levels of ambition and expectations. On the positive side, Secretary Blinken stressed that President Biden considers the two-state solution the only way to ensure Israel's future as a Jewish and democratic state, and the only way to give the Palestinians a state to which they are entitled. So this brings me to the final two questions. What should be done, and can an enhanced multilateral approach be helpful? Absolutely. An enhanced multilateral approach can be helpful. But we have to recognize that the very definition of a two-state solution has been distorted as a result of the Trump plan. So this is why I don't think that rhetorical support for the two-state solution is enough at this point in time. I think preserving the prospect of two states must be achieved through negotiations between the Israelis and the Palestinians. It does not necessarily be direct, it doesn't necessarily need to be public, but we need to see how this can be done to reach an agreement. It doesn't also need to be detailed, but it has to include two fundamental issues in order for it to be balanced. It has to accommodate the territorial requirements of a Palestinian state on the basis of the 1967 borders, and it will have to ensure Israel's security. I know that this is a tall order, but I think this needs to be orchestrated by the US with the help of others in the context of the multilateral approach that was asked about, with the help of the Arab Quartet, the Europeans, the United Nations, and it should be enshrined in a Security Council resolution, especially that the United States has already indicated that that both sides should refrain from unilateral steps that would undermine the two-state solution. At the same time, I think that the administration should also signal very clearly and in a credible way that to all the parties concerned that there will be repercussions for non-compliance and for threatening the possibility of the two-state solution. And we had a success story of sorts only a few months ago. There was a concerted effort to avoid annexation, and this succeeded for a combination of incentives and disincentives, including normalization with the United Arab Emirates, warnings from the Arab world, from Europeans, and also huge efforts by the UN and others. Of course, we can't forget that there were also some internal Israeli complexities. So the stars were aligned to achieve these objectives. We need another alignment of the stars. More recently, the Munich group that consists of Egypt, Jordan, Germany, and France suggested specific and concrete confidence-building measures to both the Israelis and the Palestinians as a prelude to resuming negotiations. I hope that this effort can be resumed once an Israeli government is formed. Hopefully it would be a more forthcoming government, and that the US would be more actively engaged, not necessarily at the presidential level. We know that this will not happen, but in a manner that can advance Israeli-Palestinian peace, playing the role of the chef d'orchestre in some form or another. I think that future effort should also endeavor to ensure that the recent agreements for normalization and any possible future steps in this direction can constitute a bridge to advance peace rather than a means to bypass this conflict. Because I think history has taught us that this conflict would not be marginalized, and we don't want it to return with vengeance. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Youssef. And Nickolay, will be moving on to you.
Thank you, Merav, and thank you, Nimrod and Mitvim, for organizing this panel. In my previous capacity as the UN Special Representative on the ground, we worked very intensely with you guys, and we've always admired much of your work and your recommendations. Let me pick up from where Hesham left it by saying that I don't believe actually that there is any chance to return to the previous framework for a Middle East peace process the way that it had existed in the past. If there are attempts to return to that framework, these attempts will be seen by the population, both in Palestine and Israel, as fake. And that will be quite dangerous because we have seen a very different generation of people emerge on both sides of the conflict, and different themes have emerged in driving these populations and different political realities which shape their perspectives and narratives for the future. Yes, multilateralism can play a role, but multilateralism cannot alone resolve the conflict. It requires a very serious internal political debate, both in Israel and Palestine, and serious political will, which unfortunately right now is missing. It is missing both on the Israeli and the Palestinian side for objective and subjective reasons. Elections in Israel, again, inconclusive, maybe a fifth election coming around the corner. The prospect of a Palestinian election and how that turns out extremely important for the future of Palestine's institutions and leadership. But also, as was said earlier, this is no longer a priority for the international community. We've seen the Biden administration return to the theme of a two-state solution, which is extremely important because if there is one thing that needs to be, if there are two things that need to be preserved in how this conflict can be resolved, one is the basis of a two-state solution, and two is the process of negotiations, peaceful negotiations between the parties with international support, etc. But we've seen also in the European Union that this is no longer a priority. We see many countries in Europe diverge from positions that we used to be considered consensus by the European Union, and that also weakens Europe's ability to interact. Now, how we deal with this situation, I would say that there are two vectors which need to be addressed. Firstly, we need to see what both Israelis and Palestinians can do on their own, unilaterally, to protect the prospect of a two-state solution and a negotiated resolution to the conflict, which means both advancing certain steps on the ground that are positive and refraining from certain steps which are negative and undermine the prospect of a resolution. And certainly both sides need to take different steps. And I'm quite encouraged actually that this is an approach that seems to be at the core of the Biden administration's perspective on the conflict. What are the positive steps that need to be encouraged to preserve the prospect, and what are the negative steps that need to be discouraged? But when I say discouraged, they really need to be discouraged, not just in words, because we have a very dangerous trajectory of the reality on the ground, with both expansion of Israeli settlements into the West Bank continuing quite dramatically over the last few years, radicalization of public opinion on both sides, the continuing divide between Hamas and Fatah and Gaza and the West Bank. A lot of things need to be done on that front. Now, if these things can be encouraged by the international community, it's not enough just to bring in the old formats that have existed in the past, the Americans, the Europeans, the Russians, the UN. These formats need to be opened up, and we need to see new players, because it is not just the Abraham Accords that have brought the Gulf into this equation. It is the very reality that we have in terms of security and politics in the Middle East that make countries like Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, others, much more key players in the future resolution of the conflict. So I would look at a formula for mediating a resolution to the conflict that actually includes a far greater weight of the Arab countries than we have done in the past. Because in all honesty, in the past, often this has been more of a courtesy rather than a real engagement, and that certainly needs to change. In this respect, the Abraham Accords provide a very good platform, and I think they're a good initiative in that sense. Now, we also need to recognize what we define when we say peace, because to many on the ground, peace is what we have now, and that is really the absence of war and the absence of conflict. And to many outside of the Israeli-Palestinian confines, this is enough. The fact that there is no active conflict between Hamas and Israel or in the West Bank is enough given the other conflicts that the region has. But if we define peace as a sustainable resolution to the conflict, which allows Palestinians and Israelis to be masters of their own fate, to live in states of their own, to figure out the economic security and other arrangements that need to be put in place for them to be successful, we need a very different definition of peace. And that is why I started in the beginning that if we just want to return to the old way of phrasing things in this conflict, we're not going to get very far. And certainly in this prospect, there is a role for the international community, but that is a role of a facilitator, a mediator, sometimes quiet, sometimes more public. There is a role to put in place incentives for returning back to negotiations, but also disincentives from withdrawing from a negotiated framework. And again, this is where I think in the prospect of incentives and disincentives, it is not just the Americans, the Europeans, the Russians, but the Arabs that must play a very key role. And in that respect, the Abraham Accords are quite critical. And lastly, we need to set up a process that isolates, or more like insulates, any future negotiation from all of those who will attempt to disrupt it. And believe you me, there will be plenty of forces out there who will attempt and do way beyond what we can even imagine at this point to disrupt a Palestinian-Israeli resolution to the conflict. These will be regional forces beyond the region, but very much forces within both Israeli and Palestinian society who do not want to see that succeed. So in closing, I would say that yes, there are opportunities emerging. Certainly the international involvement in the future will no longer be limited only to America. It will have to be multilateral. It will certainly need to have a more stronger engagement by the Arabs. But we certainly need to see also internally in both societies a wish to return back to meaningful negotiations, which unfortunately for now we don't. Because if we don't get into that formula, the risk of radicalization, be that religious or political, will rise very quickly. And the disenchantment between the people and their leadership, the disconnect between people and their leadership will be further complicated, and that will limit all opportunities for any meaningful engagement. Thank you, Merav. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Nickolay. Nathalie, we are on to you.
Well, thank you so much, Merav, and thanks for the invitation to Mitvim. And in a sense, much of what I'm going to say is really going to echo what Hesham and Nickolay have said before me. I'll just perhaps put it in a slightly different way and sort of frame it in a slightly different way. and really try and sort of put the emphasis on the opportunities, given that normally when we talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it's just far too easy to focus on the way in which things have just been going progressively down the hill over the years. So to me, in a sense, opportunity number one is precisely the one that Nickolay was highlighting, meaning that returning to the past is not an option. The Middle East peace process as we knew it, and which, frankly speaking, failed to deliver, well, if ever, but at least, over a decade from now, it's certainly, I mean, sort of prospects in that sort of framework and method to deliver gradually dissipated. And yet for a number of years, there was really this constant dance around the talk about a Middle East peace process, which was really framed in, indeed, sort of US carrying not simply the sort of lion's share of the weight in this process, but really essentially conducting this process. And I very much share the assessment that that world has gone. It has gone because the last attempt at that kind of negotiation dates back to what, 7 years ago now? So a number of years have passed since when we can even pretend that something was actually going on. And 7 years of kind of nothing is a fair amount of time. Because the United States itself is indicating that it doesn't, there isn't the sort of strong political will to go back to that kind of framework. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is neither the first, second, third, fourth, or probably even 10th, or perhaps 10th is a slight exaggeration, but certainly I would say would not make it into the first 5 priorities of the Biden administration's foreign policy agenda. So, I think, why is this good news? Well, it's good news, obviously, because that particular framework, with all of its merits, with all of the goodwill that was put into it, obviously failed to deliver. Otherwise, we wouldn't be sitting here today having this conversation. So that, in a sense, has to be, in my view, viewed as an opportunity. Then, sort of second point is, well, if that's the case, what's the alternative? And here is where we get into the sort of multilateralizing the peace process discussion, and multilateralizing the peace, in a sense, discussion. And I think a sort of point to make, and perhaps here I have a slightly different take from Nickolay when it comes to the normalization agreements, is, I think there is good multilateralism and bad multilateralism. I mean, at the end of the day, multilateralism is a means, it's not an end. So the point is the extent to which it furthers the end of achieving a sustainable peace that we are discussing in the region. And I think the sort of multilateralism that does not help, and incidentally, this is a reflection that is not limited, by the way, to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but more broadly. I mean, there are forms of, for instance, regional cooperation that actually cement divisions, conflict divides, cleavages. And there are forms of regional cooperation and dialogue that actually bridge across divides. I think the way in which the normalization agreements, which are obviously sort of in many respects part and parcel of the Trump plan approach, were very much part of a form of regionalization of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that does not favor the sustainable peace that we were discussing. Because in a sense, the real risk of those agreements was that the paradigm that does lie at the heart of what I think probably we would all agree is a framework for sustainable peace in the region, which was basically the sort of land for peace paradigm, risk being substituted by a different paradigm, which was the normalization for no annexation, or normalization for the status quo, basically, which I think also connects to a point that Nickolay was making now about the distinction between peace and in a sense the absence of war. They do not amount to the same thing. They are fundamentally different things. Now, does that mean to say that therefore the normalization agreements were bad? Well, no, I don't think that either. So I think the point here is actually looking as an opportunity to the fact that it did not quite go as planned. The philosophy, if you like, of the Abraham Accords did not quite work out exactly as foreseen. And therefore, what we can stick to is the good part of all of this. And the good part of all of this is that it does bring in sort of regional countries as having a stake, in a sense, into the future of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and therefore peace. The third and the final point that I wanted to make is really about the content of all of this. And I think there is a third opportunity that revolves around the magic word of democracy. And of course, obviously, this inevitably then also connects to the debates about the 3 Palestinian elections. I think it was a terrible shame the way in which democracy basically really went out of fashion for almost a decade, I would say. In fact, a decade, I would say, in the region. And in fact, when it comes to Palestine, more than a decade. I mean, it kind of went out of fashion in 2006. And I think this was, particularly sort of broadening out beyond Palestine. If we look particularly at the period, I would say between 2013, 2014, up until last year, end of last year, literally, for different reasons, democracy kind of was not the sexiest thing in the world anymore. It was either because, hey, we don't really like the results that come out of elections, hence the story. In a sense, 2006 was a precursor of the general feeling, which then sort of expanded beyond Palestine and really sort of expanded with the outcome, obviously, of the Arab uprisings. So there was a sense of, we don't really want to touch the democracy piece of this. There was then this broader sense of, sort of a return to geopolitics on the world stage. This is about the hard stuff that matters. I mean, it's about sort of power politics that matters. It's not this kind of fluffy democracy promotion sort of set of issues, which was so fashionable in the 1990s and the early 2000s. So in a sense, the sort of world was going in that direction, and not only, but also the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was a victim of this. I think then this obviously kind of exacerbated even further, of course, with, and in a sense, it reached its apex, if you think about it, particularly over the last 4 years, in which democracy came in under attack. It came under attack in Europe with the rise of nationalist populism, and of course it came under attack in the United States. Now, the fact that it did almost, it risked going beyond a tipping point, has now brought democracy back into the foreign policy agenda more broadly. So whether we're talking about the Middle East, whether we're talking about the United States, whether we're talking about Europe, democracy has again become an important piece of the puzzle. And so I think the opportunity that this raises, given that there is Palestinian elections, is in a sense to sort of refocus, not simply on the means, the multilateral means, but the actual content. What is it? What are the rights component? What is the participation component that actually makes whatever kind of peace a sustainable one? So I think there is an opportunity, which is why, incidentally, I think that as Europeans, the elections piece is really one on which we have to continue pressing. I mean, I don't think we should take it as a foregone conclusion that these elections will take place. I think there will be all sorts of pushbacks and resistances coming and sort of leading up over the next few weeks and months. And I think we should take this as an opportunity to say, well, okay, we don't quite know what the multilateral format's going to be. We don't quite know what the shape of an Israeli-Palestinian peace is going to be. But what we do know is whatever shape and whatever format that takes, the content has to be one which starts from a respect of individual rights, and obviously democracy being a key component of this. So to me, in a sense, and just to close off, that is the one point of real urgent attention on which we should concentrate now. And I'll stop there, Merav.
Thank you very much, Nathalie. Nimrod, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'll begin by saying that when we talk about international involvement in efforts to advance peace, it cannot be by any means a replacement or a substitute to domestic pro-peace actions by Israelis and Palestinians. You know, as we saw in the past, almost every breakthrough in the Israeli-Arab peace process happened by the actors themselves, with some support of the international community, mostly in the lead-up between the breakthrough to an actual signing of a peace agreement or some sort of other accord. The international involvement is important, though, because it could preserve options for the two-state solution, because it could create better conditions for its future implementation, because it can prevent escalation and stop unilateral steps that may make peace more harder to achieve, because it could create a momentum for progress. It could empower pro-peace actors in Israel and Palestine, and it could show to our publics that the issue is still relevant for the international community when many people think otherwise. And it's obvious that at a time of stagnation in the peace process for years, and at a time when countries are facing so many other pressing issues, our topic is not a priority. And it's more difficult to create this international involvement that we took for granted in previous years. But the growing sense of multilateralism in international politics may be some sort of an opportunity for change. And the fact that we saw multilateralism gaining traction, beginning from a counter-reaction to Trump's policies by some countries, then being part of the global reaction to COVID, and now maybe becoming a formal component of American foreign policy, could in a way lead international action to a place that brings it into the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. Because multilateralism is no stranger to the peace process. You know, we saw it in the past. The Madrid Conference, 1991, the multilateral talks following that, the establishment of the Quartet were all multilateral actions. Yes, the US was usually the leading one. That's the way the US wanted it to be. Even when it acknowledged the need for multilateralism, the US was on the front. That's the way Israel wanted it to be. Israel was always wishing for American involvement and blocking others from stepping in. But even at the time when the US did not play this role under Trump, and even at the time when the Palestinians went out to different capitals from Beijing to Moscow to Europe and asked for this involvement, other countries did not really pitch in. So if we're talking about multilateral efforts, increased one, we should acknowledge that it is the Americans that need to push for that to happen. Bring other countries in there, give them the space, treat them as more equal partners. And some spaces in which this approach can really be constructive are as following, and I'll say them very briefly. First, by talking about parameters for a final status agreement. Now, in previous years, we've been speaking about updating the parameters for the two-state solution. Most of the guiding documents now leading international discussions about the peace process, and notwithstanding the Trump plan, which I see as irrelevant for these efforts, are 20 years old or so. You know, from the roadmap to the Arab Peace Initiative to the Clinton parameters, these are outdated. They are not relevant to recent realities, and they should be brought up to date by international consensus, also reflecting the international position on how to solve the Israeli-Palestinian issue. This is important not in a way to dictate what the final status outcome will be, but in giving it a frame and enabling discussions about smaller steps on the ground within a broader context of a vision for peace, something that, when it's lacking, raises a lot of skepticism about efforts to do a day-by-day effort. The second issue is something Nickolay referred to, and that's updating the international mechanism. We have the Quartet in place for many years, the UN, the US, Russia, the United Nations. We saw the Quartet not functioning almost at all during Trump. And now with Biden, the Quartet is once again resuming its regular meetings. And it seems like most of the partners within the Quartet are quite happy about the structure of it now and are not really motivated to change it. And even some of the countries outside of this structure are not really motivated to pitch in. But as Hesham said and mentioned the Munich group, France and Germany and Jordan and Egypt, and we saw the Arab Quartet, other countries are looking for ways to be involved. And I think this is the time to reevaluate what is the right composition of this international mechanism to support the peace process and to invite formally other countries, whether Arab states or European states, to be involved. And doing that in coordination with Israeli and Palestinian pro-peace actors, because the involvement of the actors in the conflict themselves should not be neglected when the international community makes its own moves, in order to ensure that international moves are in coordination with what the local needs actually are. And that leads us to the next phase about incentives. And yes, there is a place for disincentives, but incentives is an issue in which the international community already agreed upon several years ago. There is a need to somehow bring together American security guarantees and European offers for upgrading of ties and the Arab offers for normalization into some sort of an international coordinated incentive package that was not acted upon from 2016 until today, partly because there was no effective mechanism to do so, partly because there were doubts about the benefit of doing so. But I think a new mechanism and a new multilateralism approach should take the issue of devising such a package into its agenda and present Israelis and Palestinians with concrete benefits for the future of peace. It will not bring peace overnight, but it will definitely shape the conversation in our domestic audiences a bit differently. A multilateral approach could also help leverage events, and you mentioned the Abraham Accords, and you mentioned the Palestinian elections. These events can take place outside of the scope of Israeli-Palestinian peacemaking efforts, but it's our responsibilities as actors who are committed to the idea of peace, who want to maximize opportunities, to try and link them up. And how do we reframe the Abraham Accords in a way that does see them as a process towards advancing Israeli-Palestinian peace? How do we look at the Palestinian election as a way to advance unity within the Palestinian system? Because the split between Gaza and the West Bank is one of the major structural obstacles facing the two-state solution. So the international community could help leverage ongoing events to support Israeli-Palestinian peacemaking. And finally, the issue of civil society. There's almost a total disconnect now between Israelis and Palestinians. There are a few NGOs continuing to bring together Israelis and Palestinians, but this is not happening much. And at the time when the US Congress is allocating a significant amount of new funding to advance Israeli-Palestinian interaction, following up on the Quartet report, which called for such interaction to be increased, and on existing support by other international actors towards civil society organizations, maybe this is a time for multilateral action to somehow coordinate the support, international support, towards such activities by people on the ground, and helping to dismantle some of the opposition within the Palestinian society and some of the indifference within the Israeli society to the importance of such activities. So I think this is some sort of a menu for international activity under the notion of multilateralism that will not bring peace overnight, but will definitely change the calculation and create a new momentum, which could hopefully later, when we have the right political leadership, help guide us towards peace.
Thank you very much, Nimrod. We're quite short on time, but let's try to make a final round. Maybe each one of you can give in a sentence or two. Is there maybe a player who has not participated yet in this process, but you think this can be involved? And if so, how? In one or two sentences. Let's start. Hesham, maybe we can start with you.
Well, all the players are known. I think what Nimrod is saying is to try to see how these players can act in a manner that would be more effective. We have seen in the last few days China making a proposal in relation to the situation in the Middle East. Russia made a proposal earlier. Abu Mazen wants an international compact. So we need to see how this can be done in an orchestrated way in a manner that could advance peace.
Thank you. Nickolay, do you have any thoughts?
Well, the one player who seems to have always been missing from Middle East peace discussions are the people, both the Palestinians and the Israelis. And the real test right now, as Nathalie said, would be the Palestinian election to see if there can be a reconnect between the Palestinian people and their leadership. And it's important not just to have an election, but to have an election with a level playing field in which everyone is able to freely compete. On the Israeli side, we have a lot of elections, but we really need to see some more thinking internally in Israel on how can you guarantee Israel's future security and prosperity in the context of peace. And that can only be done through civil society. Closing off with what Nimrod said, I think it's extremely important for international engagement with civil society groups on both sides to break down this wall that has become a very firm wall of division between Israelis and Palestinians, in which daily interaction has been limited, etc. The Americans, the Europeans, and others can play a very, very important role in that. And lastly, never forget that involving the Arab countries, Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, and others, should not be a courtesy. It is a necessity for resolving the problems.
Thank you, Nickolay. Nathalie?
Yes, well, I can only sort of back what Nickolay was just saying now, you know, particularly on the sort of involving people, involving the people that at the end of the day are the ones that will make this fly or fail. So that would be my point number one. And my second point, which is also connected to a point that Hesham was mentioning, is yes, indeed, the players are known, but perhaps it is not about introducing new players, but involving them in a different way, in a way which is more reflective also of the way in which the international system is changing. You know, sort of to sort of, you know, to mention the Chinas and Russias of this world, and in particular looking at the way in which they have, you know, on a different, quite thorny question, like the Iran nuclear deal, they have been able to work together with the West in a manner that was then organically linked. So it's a question of, you know, devising a, let's call it, contact group, which is flexible and nimble enough to deliver, but at the same time, which has its rootings in international law through the United Nations, is, I think, a lesson from that particular format, which can be reflected on. It's not a question of applying it as it is, because I agree with Nickolay. I think in this particular context, there is an issue of involving regional players, in a way in which actually maybe this was one of the mistakes of the Iran nuclear deal. It did not happen on that particular format. So I think it's, as I said, it's not a question of kind of inventing new players, but perhaps inventing new formats to involve them and sort of bring out more their responsibility in this conflict. Thank you.
Nimrod?
I will be looking at the Mediterranean sphere. I think we see the growing importance of the Mediterranean in Israeli and regional politics, also in Palestinian thinking. And in the Mediterranean, we see mechanisms already set in place, not necessarily relevant at the moment to the Israeli-Palestinian issue, but perhaps could be like that in the future. Whether it's the East Med Gaz Forum that brings Israel and the Palestinian Authority together to the same space with Arab states, with European states, with American and EU involvement, and maybe also the Union for the Mediterranean, where Israel and Palestine are also part of the same platform. So trying to utilize those existing platforms in which Israelis and Palestinians are already there, together with the major international actors, and looking how those mechanisms could somehow be constructive to Israeli-Palestinian peacemaking, I think is an effort worth making.
Thank you, Nimrod, and I want to thank you all for participating here and sharing your thoughts. We definitely have a lot of work to do on this term, but if we all work together, maybe the next panel could see how the process has been made and changes made. Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much.